Hello, and welcome to the 5th live talk show of GloComNet, Portal of Global Complexity Network. My name is Connie Dorstein and I'm your host today. This broadcast is part of a series of 6 monthly broadcasting programs around the theme of complexity. These programs, and thus this broadcast, are interactive, which means you can join us by active participation. By sending an email to info@glocomnet.com, you can reach the editor immediately, who will then try to get your question on the table. Today we are talking about storytelling, and joining me are Professor Lex Hoogduin, University of Groningen, and Harold van Garderen. Harold is founder and director of Story Connect, a company which has a unique approach to improve organizations based on raw human experiences. Welcome. One of the oldest, if not the oldest discipline in the world of relaying experience and expertise is storytelling. It relates anything from culture to techniques, to how to survive and thrive from one generation to the other, from one tribe to another. As we progressed and developed, unfortunately, storytelling started to get hidden in a maze of other techniques like educational format, interview techniques, and all other elements where the expert became the prime source of wisdom. Oddly enough, at the same time, we saw a desire to capture the customer experience, but very often without asking him or her for their personal experiences to start with. Letting them tell the story without steering it into a format of our choice before embarking on a transformation journey is vital. Tonight we speak about getting to the core by storytelling and as such eliminating expert prejudice. In current times where uncertainty reigns, whether it concerns matters of government, disasters, incidents, healthcare, or becoming truly customer-centric as an enterprise, storytelling might well be a more valuable technique and tool than you think. Perception is reality. Let's go. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Harold, welcome. I believe you came in contact with storytelling or participatory narrative inquiry, as people call it, P&I. We will use that term more often in the program, through Cynthia Kurtz, who was interviewed by Lex in the very same studio on a previous occasion. So maybe it's an idea if we take a look at what she has to say first?
Yes.
Thank you.
Good idea.
It has 2 parents. One parent is narrative inquiry, which is a field of research in which experts go out and they interview people and ask them about their lives and what's happened to them. And then they take it back and they do what experts do, and they write their report. And that's a wonderful established field for many decades. But the other parent of what I call P&I is participatory action research. And action research is, I think, a very exciting field, which says that when you do research on people, you change them because they're people, right? And you're people. So research is action and action is research. And so in action research, there's a participatory element where you do research together with the people that you're studying. And so this work is a marriage of the ideas of story examining analysis with a participatory element. So we get people to tell stories, but we then ask them to look at their own stories and interpret them, talk about them.
Harold, so you got intrigued by the work Cynthia was doing. So in the vein of storytelling, tell us how your sort of mental meeting, how this happened and why.
Yeah, at the time, I think it was 2003, I was working as a services researcher in a company called OC, which is a producer of photocopiers and printers. And it happened that soon before that they had taken over a large services firm. And so the question arose, where do services come from? Because we were a technology-driven company. And that was a big question, and one day I was invited by the HR manager, and he said, Harold, you're a chemist, and you did something with complexity in your PhD. This is an article by Cynthia Kurtz and Dave Snowden from the IBM Systems Journal. Why don't you read it and try to make sense of it, because I'm just a simple physicist. Okay, so I started reading the article, of which Cynthia was the first author, and at the time P&I was still called narrative sense making, and it was a wonderful practical because they applied complexity science to narrative research, and that was what we needed to listen to customers who were experiencing services.
Yeah. So why don't you draw a bit of a format? Tell us a little bit more, like, what is storytelling? What is the purpose? And sort of what is the format?
Well, of course, we are all familiar with the commercial form of storytelling that has even gone into TV advertising, where you design a story and try to deliver a message. But imagine that you are the producer of a product, or you run a services organization, and any action in front of an audience basically creates the same number of experiences in the audience then there are people in the audience. So when you sell a product, or when you run a hospital, or when you're on stage and you tell a story, big story, a created story, then everybody in the audience can tell a story back. And that same happens in services, it happens with products, because every human is unique. And they have a story to share about the product, about the service. And what we do in P&I is try to bring these stories together and try to help organizations to make sense of what's happening. What are people thinking? What are the unknowns? What are the unseens? And as we all know, in a complex system, information is distributed. There is no central point where all the information comes together. So if you want to work with something, you have to get experiences from people to make sense of them.
And so it doesn't replace sort of the hardcore fact finding about services, etc., but it does play to how you put the products and services together based on how people will perceive it. Does it mean that you then segment it, or do you get all this information together and you can bring it into one core product or service offering? Because it comes from a myriad of people. The stories can vary from A to Z.
Yeah. Of course, it would be ideal if your research shows that you only need to create one product or one service variety. But as we all know in the shops, or we see everywhere, you need a variety of products to cover the preferences of the public. The question always is, how many and which?
Yeah.
And I think that's where P&I comes in, because the experts in the R&D and marketing department can never specify with certainty which these should be. So if you ask your users to tell stories about the product and work with them, you can find out the segments and what comes together with what.
And obviously you're not talking about products and services, but this can also be used in events or incidents. Or can you give us an example of that, how that would work?
In events, for instance, you have somebody that delivers a story from the stage. In P&I, the thinking would be, in marketing, the thinking would be, how good is this story delivered to the minds of the people? Yeah. While in P&I, the thinking would be, who in the audience can improve this story or help the storyteller on stage improve its story the next time? So how do we get the knowledge and the experience of the people into that delivered story? So we try to make things, how you say that?
Circular.
Yeah, to create a feedback between how the story is told in the form of a product or a service or delivery, and the knowledge of the network surrounding. And I think that's one of the links to complexity thinking.
And so you start off with interviewing a lot of people and letting them tell the story in their very own way.
No, well, interviewing a lot.
Interview is probably the wrong word.
Yeah.
So tell us, what technique do you use to get the story out of them?
There are situations where we interview people, and that's when people are very busy or very damaged. For instance, handicapped people, you need to interview those. But in all the other situations, you bring people around the table like this, and you prompt them. Elicitation questions are questions that you ask them to tell a story. And not a story to me or to my colleagues, but a story to each other. For instance, I could ask Lex, and I hope he can't answer, what was the last time you went to a hospital? What happened that made a lasting impression on you? and what story would you share about
Yeah.
showing how good or bad the quality of that hospital is. And I said, I hope you can't answer that because you never had to go to hospital,
Yeah.
but you can ask that to any patient.
Yeah.
And that's a way around the table. If you drop that question, somebody there starts telling them, and then that one reacts, I know a similar story, or I know a completely opposite story, or I know a different story.
Okay.
And then the process of story sharing, just like what you refer to, the old days around the campfire, happens then around the table.
Yeah.
And when that doesn't work, when you can't get the people together, you develop what we call a story point, in which you also ask this question, which can be a video or a simple button, and you ask people to write down a story or to upload a photo and answer questions about their story, what emotions they felt,
Yeah.
how people acted, all questions that point into the story. Or, yeah.
So the techniques you use go beyond words. You can also use images or
Drawings.
as long as it's a personal experience.
Yeah, as long as it's narrative and not factual.
Okay, so what type of organizations or institutions would ask you to use that technique? Because obviously you're going to get incredibly honest feedback.
Yeah. That's a nice thing and also a difficult thing. One of the things we find out to handle that honesty is make sure the stories don't go into the open without any control, especially when there are privacy issues, for instance, with youth care or hospital care. Then you have to work with the stories, find the patterns, and the patterns tell the stories, in which department, at what moment, feelings were negative. That's all you need to know, and you can make some stories anonymous and use them to illustrate the pattern. So you don't need all the stories.
No.
Doesn't it also require some courage, especially in hierarchical organizations and culture, to say from the top? Because basically you give the floor to the people who have really have the experience.
There is a tendency that organization starts with customers because it's not about their employees.
Okay.
And the other thing with P&I is it doesn't prove anything, it only indicates things. And that's, I think, comes back to its roots in IBM, that it was developed to find where terrorism could hit. And then you can also not prove anything, but you want to know.
Yeah.
And I think it's also a strong point that it doesn't prove anything, because nobody can be blamed that the story was told. Story creates distance between what actually happened and what somebody tells about the event.
Yeah.
So you have to take the stories as a given and not starting to interpret the stories or giving
The
an
stories
opinion.
itself now.
It's a perspective on reality.
Yeah, however, I can imagine that if you have like major incidents you have in a country, like at one point years ago, we had this incident where things went completely out of hand at a big pop concert, and the police sort of, in the minds of many people, overreacted. I can imagine that it would be a very powerful technique to then speak to the people who were there afterwards to really try to figure out what truly happened.
Yeah, or at least find out what people thought has happened.
Yeah.
And but I think this is an example where P&I might be difficult because there is so much reconstruction going on. People, an hour after the event, have reconstructed everything away what they did wrong to get under the crowd. So it's difficult.
True, but it's still their experience.
It's still their experience, so it is how they reconstructed the experience.
Yeah.
So I think actual accidents are a bit difficult, but in general, you can interview or you can include a lot of people in your investigation, or have a lot of people being informed by stories from other people, because that's one of the things P&I does. It's not getting all the stories to the top. No, it's also getting the stories from A to B.
Yeah. Can you give us, before we move on to a more sort of formalized approach to all of this, can you give us one example of, and I understand you need to anonymize this, but can you give us one example of where the P&I methodology or approach really worked well?
Yeah, we recently did an evaluation of healthcare, youth care services in and around Leiden, which is a city somewhere near the coast. And the reason the municipality wanted this was that their regular survey-based investigation that asked, can you rate my services on a scale from 1 to 10, showed a lot of numbers but gained no insight. And we collected something like 700 stories by sending 18,000 emails to people that received healthcare. And one of the questions about the story was, how difficult or simple was it to find the right care for your child? And that showed what we call a bathtub-shaped
response.
where on the left was all the simple services like dyslexia and small behavior stuff.
Yeah.
And on the right side were all the psychological problems. And it turned out that there all the negative stories were that people said, I'm looking for 3 months, they're still on the waiting list, it doesn't work, the child is deteriorating. And that, I think, is where P&I is strong, because although you have this shape, that doesn't mean that that's an actual representation of what's going on.
No.
No, P&I triggered people with a real problem to share their story. So it magnifies the problem.
Yeah.
And then, because it's magnified, you can also do interventions to solve these problems in the complex system and see the change over time and how you see the problem being resolved.
Perfect. We'll come to that. We'll come to what we do with the stories in a minute. Lex, I finally come to you, but I really felt it was important to sort of let him tell his story in the vein of this broadcast. In previous editions of our webinars, we spoke already, if you remember, about storytelling when we did the personal development one, when we did the one about scenario building. So how do you feel that this relates to complexity and uncertainty? Why is this a useful tool for you?
Yes, it's quite a complicated, if not complex question, because I think different people will perhaps differently make the connection between the two approaches or the two phenomena. Harold already used the word knowledge many times, and I think that plays a central role. And let me be a bit philosophical and answer it in a relatively general.
We'd love you to be philosophical.
Yeah, we have
An
to.
economist who's philosophical.
Yeah,
Let's go.
let me try.
It's getting dangerous now.
Let me try a little bit. So the complexity and uncertainty are, as it were, a byproduct of what I would say is the essential human condition. And the essential human condition is that we, human beings, we act and we interact. We act in the sense that we show purposeful behavior. We always try to improve our position, and we interact because we can benefit from interacting with each other, all being very different, in very different respects, one of them being having different knowledge, different skills. And we can only act and interact on the basis of knowledge of rules of the game for interaction, of the legal system, of ethics, and also knowledge about different skills. And what stories do is to be the basis for that knowledge. Knowledge can be created by storytelling. It's the stories allow you to create knowledge about ethics, about skills, to share this knowledge and to develop this knowledge. And that's the relation between the two. So stories are, in a way, help you to create a connection between the past, the present, and the future, and are a very powerful tool that makes interaction, forming of societies, forming of a culture possible. Makes it possible to act and interact.
But I think that it is important because you spoke primarily about personal experiences people talk about. You speak of knowledge. So then you have to be able, as whoever runs the program, to admit that a personal experience is reality and therefore is knowledge.
Yeah, so what you do, so you collect, as Harold explained, you have the personal experiences, you have all those stories, and then the next step is that you, as it were, by trying to make sense of it together, you then translate it into knowledge that then can be used for different purposes.
You cannot ask a person, please share all your knowledge about this product or this hospital. But you can ask a person, can you share a couple of stories about events that happened to you that signify how you experience the services of this hospital? And then people can talk. And that's what happens at birthday parties, in business meetings, and it happens everywhere. It even happens at this table at the moment.
Yeah, but it is interesting because you took the example of a hospital, and I had this experience just after Christmas. And if you would have asked me, I would have said I was totally. I mean, the one thing that sticks in my mind was the incredibly warm and professional reception I received as a mother of whatever the victim.
Can you remember a moment that made that very practical for you? What did somebody say?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I came in and she said to me, a nurse came up and she said, your son's asleep now, but you must have been in a real shock. We understand that. She says, you look very calm, but you must be really shaken. Why don't you sit down, I'll get you a cup of coffee. She said, the coffee's awful, but you're going to get it anyway. And I thought that was just amazing, amazing.
And that's a story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. So it's happening already. So now, obviously, we need to document, and if you want to work with it in a program, at some way you need to document it. Can you as a company or as an institution then build a collective library of?
Yeah, there are many things that you can do with it. One of the things that I find attractive is indeed to use it to share knowledge that only a limited number of people have, and then be able to preserve that knowledge, and that you can use it again in the future, perhaps by very different people. So, for instance, we talked about incidents a couple of some time ago, earlier today. What I find very powerful, for instance, in the risk management business, if there has been an incident, that you immediately collect the experience of the people that were involved in the incident, have their stories, and then do a P&I exercise, a sense-making exercise. What actually happened there? And do that together, and then after that, try to translate it in what I indeed would call a library of wisdom, that you have do's and don'ts in certain types of situations, so that people that were not involved but will then be trained on the basis of that library of wisdom, recognize the type of situation when it occurs again. And that's a very I think powerful way of doing it, certainly in terms of incidents and crises, which fortunately don't happen quite often. And it's far more difficult to tackle those exercises and those events via the more traditional techniques that we have developed over time. Storytelling, in a way, has been moved into the background. It's very old, but we have come to the conclusion that we can forecast everything, that we can calculate everything, that we can model everything. But it's very difficult to model things that don't happen quite often, and you can track them much earlier if you do it on the basis of storytelling. And you can and you can learn from them much better than on the basis of statistical models.
I would love to get an example from both of you where you really sort of see that people draw back to the library of wisdom. Because I think actually if you look at the format of, for instance, a family, families carry their own library of wisdom throughout the generations, and they pull back to stories of parents, grandfathers. Do you have examples where people really look back at this library of wisdom, or where you can use it?
Yeah, I would immediately mention not a, let's say, a private example, but an example indeed from the risk management business, and that's the experience of the crisis that we had in 2008, and there I know companies who have really benefited from this type of approach by collecting stories from people who were directly involved in managing the crisis, and which has directly led to an improvement in the way that they handle those situations at the moment.
Yeah.
And as I said, I think it's very powerful. It's much more powerful than the, let's say, the what I would call the normal approach to reacting to incidents, which is also trying to evaluate what happens.
Yeah.
But that's basically done either by an outsider who looks at it, who has not experienced it him or her firsthand, or it's done indeed in a way top down, not involving the people who really had to manage this, and you miss a lot. And you coming back to what this does, this helps you to draw on all the experience and knowledge that is involved around this incident, and it's one of the solutions to the fact that indeed experiences are widespread. It's not only the top that can look at it.
Every crisis is unique, so you need a unique response to each new crisis, or else it wouldn't be a crisis.
Yeah, and so we've collected all these stories. How then do you take that? Is that the end of the program, or is it normally, if you do, like we took the example of the youth care, you take an example of, for instance, the hospital. How then do you then involve the people who run the place to make a transformation? What are the next steps?
Story collection ends when you have something like 80 or 200 stories, which is usually enough to make sense of the situation. And it's not us that make sense of the situation, but it is the people themselves. So we invite managers, we invite the frontline staff into a workshop where we already looked at the patterns and selected patterns that are standing out of the data. Of course, experiences in a neonatal unit are more negative than in the birth unit. Let's hope so. But if you take out these obvious signals and you find the signals that are striking, you bring them to a table and people of the organization make sense. And then you got this, is this how we handle this? It's not us telling them what's happened, it's them discovering what's happening in their own organization. And the end of these kind of sense-making sessions is, we call them decision and intervention, to have them create a set of experiments or measures or changes so that they say, we are gonna change ourselves this way. It's not us telling them what to do, it's them saying, with the knowledge, our local knowledge, these are things that we could change, so let's do that tomorrow. So it's direct feedback from the stories to sense-making to intervention.
Yeah. And does it work in any culture? Because, I can imagine that if any country, any culture, I mean, we tend to work in a very open, at least we think we are, open society where we don't have to fear anything. Does it work in any religion, culture, or can you make it work in any culture or religion? It's probably the better question.
I don't know. Thus far, we haven't found a situation where we didn't get it work, but it was not to our genius that we got it work the first time. We did a project in Bangladesh, and in Bangladesh people are afraid of placing a dot in the middle of a square. They always, because they're marginalized people, they say, I'm always on the sidelines. So they put all their responses very extreme, as first and as last in the list, at the end of a scale or the beginning. Then you got
very
totally
interesting.
Yeah, and it seems that there's something with the color of red in China. So never use red in your. So you have to discover the cultural norms as part of the project.
I do think it is more difficult, let's say, in hierarchical cultures. I do think that it requires courage then for the top. To engage in such an exercise, because in a way you give up control.
Yeah.
You give the people the floor to tell their experiences, and you cannot be sure what comes out of it. For instance, it's also interesting. One of the things where you can also, I think, fruitfully use storytelling is in, for instance, employee satisfactory surveys, and we all have we all know probably the usual normal surveys where you get the questions very well controlled by the top and structured in a way that the outcome will be supportive of what is in the interest of the top. I think the quality of such work would be greatly enhanced if you would do that in a storytelling environment. But that requires, I think, courage, isn't it, Harold? What would you think?
Well, it also depends how you frame that. If you say we're going to replace the employee satisfaction survey with a narrative inquiry, then you got a problem. If you say we're going to look for motivational and demotivational factors in your staff, then it could be customers. Then it could be the outside world. It could be HR. It could be internal, but it could just as well be external.
Yeah.
So if you frame it as motivation, demotivation, leaving, why do people leave or enter this organization, then it's certainly far less threatening. So it's also about framing what you're trying to achieve. And that means that in the end you find employee satisfaction. That's after the fact.
But also in the sense making part. We're now perhaps talking about the phase in which you collect the stories. But at the moment that you sit together in a participatory exercise, if you then have people who are in that organization of a different hierarchical level, I think that could be difficult in some cultures. That I say, well, I think this story tells us this, and I'm not sure whether my boss agrees, and my boss is in the room.
It's in the same room, then it can become a problem in certain cultures.
Yeah, one of the solutions to that is have multiple sense-making sessions, where you, for instance, invite the quality people, you invite the medical staff, you invite, and they all make sense of the same stories, and that creates an internal tension that the people can talk about.
Yes.
So don't try to get too many levels of hierarchy into the room, unless they're on different tables. Then sometimes it works.
Okay. How often is this technique used? Is it a widely embraced methodology now, or is it, would you say, very, very early days? I mean, how long has Cynthia been involved with this?
1999.
Yeah, so
it's almost 20 years. Yeah.
And she has done hundreds of projects.
There have been hundreds of projects done. I think something like 150 by Cynthia and something like 60 or 70 by us. And that number, I've stopped counting. So I think there are in general something like 60 to 80 applications and something like 300-400 projects.
Okay.
That I know of.
Yeah.
On the one hand, so you could say, well, that's quite impressive. On the other hand, I think the field is wide open for many more applications in very different.
I think so too, because if you look at sort of the whole societal spirit, where we are in all realms of life, from whether it's tax evasion or bad behavior, we move away from the letter of the law, and we are more and more saying to people, you've got to embrace the spirit of the law. It's not enough to hide behind the text. So for me, that is almost a trend that could also then embrace, rather than having a survey and say, hey, listen, I've got a 6.8, you know, that you would move into that. Do you see that there's an increasing appetite?
As far as we can communicate the message to people that need to hear this, I would say yes.
Yeah.
There's more reception on what is the aim that we are looking for than what is the law that we should abide. And especially when for instance, in a hospital, you say we need to provide the best care we can, everybody knows that you will lose all your staff. So it's almost always also a balance.
Yeah.
What can you expect from staff to deliver good quality care? And there's always a balancing act there.
Yeah.
So setting simple rules like the best is impossible.
I think there are many areas in which you can apply it. Coming from the economics side, I think especially because, well, over the past, 80 years or so, in economics we tended to conclude or to think, I must say, that we could indeed control. Well, we could forecast, we could control, we could model it, we could steer it top down, as it were, and we didn't need to have the experience of many people with very different perspectives and having parts of the puzzle. I think it's becoming more and more clear that that is simply not no longer true. It was never true, but certainly not in the complex, interconnected world, the globalized world that we live in, the digitalized world that we live in. And this brings these very old techniques back on the table.
It's part of the move towards the knowledge society. We now do a project which is called the Dutch ID Monitor, in which we ask people at the gates at Schiphol Airport to share stories about how the passport is used, and that resulted in 3 improvements of the passport. Because the frontline staff indicated in design flaws in the passport, which was developed by a very high-tech organization, but the technicians went too far.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very good example that the knowledge of users as a collective is very powerful in improving a product.
And it starts to become embedded in the design.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you emphasize, and I rightly so, I think the customer side, but it's also internally in companies where
Exactly.
there was far too much emphasis on, let's say, top-down knowledge, technocratic knowledge on how to run the company, and that doesn't work anymore.
No.
And people feel that they no longer can completely control top-down an organization. You need other methods and techniques to do that, and there are several such techniques, and I think storytelling certainly one of them. And the P&I variant I find especially attractive.
So here's another question that sort of came up in my mind. We now speak about storytelling, about past or current experiences. Can you also apply this if, as a company, for instance, now with this whole event of open banking or new technology, that companies say, we really are slightly stuck at our strategy setting. Where do we need to go? There's so much uncertainty. We have to redesign our company, we have to redesign what we're doing. Can you also deploy this methodology for stories that haven't happened yet? For futurist strategies or...
It's perfectly possible to have a series of workshops in organizations where you do a kind of scenario planning in an afternoon with customers, with internal staff, with risk managers, whatever. And from that you get a set of scenarios that are in principle always also contain, let's define an ideal future or a very negative future, and create paths together how to get there.
Yeah.
So if you do that with several perspectives in your organization, effectively you can do a high quality scenario study in a week.
Exactly, but a company would say, we do scenario planning, but then they sort of go in safe words like agile, digital. So you say, no, go beyond that. You can, in scenario planning, you can use this as a technique.
Yeah, the scenario studies I've been involved in took 9 months. Usually the end report was outdated by the time that the consultant company produced it. And today we simply say, why don't we have a scenario week every 3 months?
Yeah.
And we do scenario sessions with for example, nobody buys this, by the way, but the idea is perfect to have a scenario week every 2 months and update your scenarios from 3 months ago so that you can get the kind of...
But through storytelling.
Yeah, through storytelling.
No, I think, again, in economics, this is very powerful. Because what we learn from complexity is and uncertainty is that we cannot forecast the future, but we can imagine it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have the power of imagination, and we underuse it, as it were. Very interesting analysis, for instance, by Timothy Geithner, former, I think, Minister of Finance during the 2008 crisis. And he, after the event, tried to analyze in a book that's called Stress Test.
Yeah.
Why did nobody see it coming? How could it happen? And in the end, this whole voluminous book comes down to 3 words. lack of imagination.
Yeah.
And we have to use our imaginary tools and create stories. And in let's say, in risk management, it's creating stories that perhaps are relatively extreme, but still plausible, could happen.
Yeah.
And that's far more effective in the end than trying to extrapolate the past in models, because one thing that you know for sure is that the future will be different from the past.
It probably goes even beyond that, because if you look pre-2008, there's not a single banker who would put on a PowerPoint or on an Excel sheet, I think it's all going to bust. But if you would have had individual conversations with them, you could have picked up on their worries, because I'm sure there were people who were worried.
Yeah.
You know that from evidence. From interviews.
There were a lot of people outside the banking sector that predicted
Yes.
it. But they were not in the conversation.
Yeah, they were not in the conversations.
And then it is important, I think we discussed that during the scenario session, that if you make these imaginations, you create this fiction, but still potential could happen, to do something with it. So again, then you have to make sense of it, and you have to think about, okay, but if this could happen, what should I do? For instance, in a bank, should I have additional buffers? Should I take other preparatory measures? So you should not...
Or should I just monitor the development of this signal over time? If you can do scenario planning every month, and there is a group of customers that say, this could go wrong, is that a persistent signal? Does it also happen with another group of people? Does it also happen in other countries? And then you can aggregate that data, say, suppose they're right, what would happen then?
Yeah.
And
that's a very, very good early warning system.
And I love technology. If you look at the way your business does storytelling projects, we were talking about people around the table. Is it necessary that it's always physical and live, or can you use technology? Can you use whatever, WhatsApp to do your storytelling, or?
Well, we currently run an experiment in the city of Breda, where we...
All in the Netherlands.
Yeah, sorry.
All in the Netherlands, the famous Netherlands, yes.
Yeah, we're quite local, I'm
That's
sorry.
fine, no.
It will change,
Where we approach people through, Facebook Messenger.
Yeah.
And we have a chatbot
Yeah.
that asks them questions. Why are you here? Can you tell us a story why you're in the city of Breda, to find what's called impact measurement or heritage. It's something with heritage. It's not my project, it's one of my colleagues. But there we use social media to get stories from people. And we have sense-making sessions later on this year with people from the municipality and city management. What are they looking for? Why are they going to this cafe? Why are they doing that street? What did they learn in that museum? And that's a form of impact management, that you actually use the smartphones in somebody's pocket as a research device.
Okay, so we can. That's good to know, because otherwise you would be very limited if it always had to be physical. But we can use all sorts of
The story point
technologies.
is it can be digital.
Yeah. So in a minute or so, I would love to talk to you too about how this all relates back to the FORC model of complexity and uncertainty. But I thought maybe it's nice to go back to your inspirator, to Cynthia, for a minute, and see how she very nicely wraps it up, and how she sets the scene, and how I think at the very end she has a little surprise in the tale for us.
Well, one of the problems with being a consultant is that you often don't hear the end of the story. I always ask, but sometimes people will say, no, you're done, go away, you know. But I believe in this one that the groups that funded the work got together and talked about the results that we found, and made some decisions about how they were going to support volunteering. A lot of times people come to me to do projects after they've done the more normal things, and they can't get very far because they give people a survey. In fact, someone was just showing me a survey for their work. Do they have support in their work? And it says things like, I feel supported in my work. I am able to accomplish my goals. I call that a do you want to keep your job survey, right? You get a lot of camouflage behavior when you ask these obvious things. So, but when you actually asked about the stories, tell me what happened, people kind of forget to do that. And so you get things. So in that instance, I doubt that we would have found these differences in motivation by asking people the standard questions, because they would have given the standard answers. Yeah. That's the difference.
Yeah, and the people asking you to do such a project, need they to be brave in a way, because they are losing, as it were, control of whatever the answers will, the stories.
You mean the person who are telling the stories, or the people who are doing the project?
The people who ask you to do the project.
Oh yes, they do. They do have to be right. And I've had sometimes when people pulled out and said, no, we can't. We want to do this, but it's too much. We can't do it. But it's my job to help them, to find a way that they can be comfortable enough to ask the questions they need to help. And one of the things we find that is an indicator of a good project is gratitude. So if you've done it right, a certain percentage of the people will unbidden say to you, thank you for asking me this. Now, can you imagine someone saying, thank you for showing me this survey? But when people tell stories, they will say, I really want to express my gratitude for this work that you're doing. And when that happens, you know you've done it right, because the people who are telling the stories, they're getting as much out of it as the people who are trying to learn something.
Yes, I mean, I said that there's a nice surprise in the end, but I thought it was really amazing that you never think of it. You think, oh, we're going to do either a storytelling exercise or a survey. We want to find out about people. And then you're worried about what you get out of it. And so I was totally amazed when I saw her video. And she said, you know what, the people who participate say they get something out of it. And I think that's probably a huge bonus, particularly as you refer to some internal cases that you could have.
I think so, yeah, absolutely.
So moving on, this is the GLOCOMNet series. We have participants from all over the world, and we have people who work with the so-called folk model. Maybe, because some people might dial in for the first time, you might want to say a few words about what it exactly is. But I would also really like to know why you're so keen on storytelling and how it fits in the model.
Yeah, so let me be as brief as possible. First of all, FAUC, FAUC stands for Framework for Acting Under Uncertainty and Complexity. And that's a model that is designed to help people to act effectively in the world as it is, complex and uncertain. It does so by developing 5, 6, 7 what we call strengths, capacities that help you to be effective. To act effectively. For instance, being alert. Because what we learn, one of the major things that we learn from looking at complexity is that there's always potential surprise. Yeah. There's always the possibility that you will be surprised either positively or negatively. And the FAUC model develops strengths that help you to deal with potential surprises. So for instance, one is alertness. That's a capacity to be able to detect potential surprises.
Storytelling.
So why are we so impressed by storytelling, and do we think it's a very helpful tool in applying the FAUC model and getting better in developing these capacities? Other is, for instance, being resilient, being adaptive, is because storytelling can help you to really develop these capacities. Yeah. We had an example earlier tonight in that it can help you to be, in a way, be more alert, having early warning of things. We had an example where you can be more resilient because you have used your imagination via stories to develop stress scenarios, and you've prepared yourself on that. On that basis, it can help you to be more creating surprises for yourself to learn, or creating surprises for others. Well, again, using stories to do that, stories in a broad sense, can be very powerful and really a complement to the more traditional ways of trying to plan things, to calculate them, and to be in control in the traditional sense. So it is a very important. It's not the only, but it's a very important method that can be used to apply this model to certain issues, or to more generally how you run a company or how you run a country, whatever.
Yeah. And do you see that a lot of, or that some of your projects are more based in a world where there's more uncertainty, and that very sort of traditional companies who think they've got it all figured out will relate to more classic techniques? The one thing that strikes me as well, which I find interesting, is you gave me some examples of marketing. And I've worked in marketing all my life, and I have always had to fight with people who try to tell you that marketing is talking. And really, marketing is 80% listening, and 20% talking. So, do you see that there's people who are reaching out to this as a tool because they realize they're working in an uncertain and complex world, or do they find it out after they've done the storytelling exercise?
Well, I must admit that most people turn to P&I after finding out that all the other things didn't work. If you can't talk to enough customers at the door to find out what's going into your organization, you need something that has bigger scale.
Yeah.
If you can't be there 24 hours a day, then maybe it's a better idea to invite them by email. Did something surprising happen today? So that's one thing. The other thing is, it depends on the application. If it's a knowledge management application, it's much more positive motivation, and then it's not threatening for the top. Nobody in the top of the organization said, I don't want to manage the knowledge of this organization. Nobody says, I want to manage or retain the knowledge that from people that leave, or get an impression for people that enter the company what is striking for you in the way we work. That are very positive applications that nobody denies. It's only when are we doing it, making things not ideal in the policy level of an organization, or youth care services, or where other. That's where things get nasty and they.
And I know that in our Glocomnet network, we have quite a number of people who have a marketing background and are indeed from this perspective interested in complexity, but then also in the type of techniques that can be useful and helpful in dealing with it.
Yeah. Now, and I don't want to hurt your business here by any means of the imagination, but let's say we have viewers who get interested in this as a technique. Is it something that you always would have to work with a professional body to do this? Or can you read up about it and start experimenting with it in your own company?
I think you can. The latter, you can do that, but there are. Perhaps it sounds simple, but it is not that easy. There are many pitfalls, and Cynthia has written 2, I think, very voluminous books. I think the first one is working with stories, and that's really a working book where she describes her own experience with storytelling, and she reports on all the pitfalls. And I think she also encourages people to try to find their own way. But I think it helps if you benefit from the experience of people who have made the mistakes already before.
What are the biggest pitfalls in storytelling? Where does it go wrong?
The moment you hear a customer saying, this is what I want to know from people, you know you're on the wrong path.
Bad sign.
Because the goal should always be, what do they want to tell to us?
Okay.
What do people want to share to each other?
Yeah, so another one. I'm sure you have another one.
Another one, let me think, starting too big. So if there's one thing in a complex system that if you see P&I as an intruder into the tools set of an organization, you're not going to bet your whole organization on P&I. So why don't you start at the kitchen table? A couple of years ago, I got a text message from a colleague. He said, is it a matter of professional deviation that I'm doing a future backwards session with my wife on the kitchen table on Saturday afternoon? I said, that's perfect professional development. because what can go wrong on the kitchen table?
Yeah.
And that same applies to the way we do projects. We don't start out big. We start with small story sessions to get a sense for what's going on culturally in the organization, or what's happening around the product, and you build from there. And you don't start big, you start small, and you start multiple times.
Yeah.
And I think another challenge perhaps more difficult thing than you may think is making people really tell stories.
Yeah.
Really
Yeah.
share experience rather than giving an analysis.
Yeah,
for
because
instance.
exactly. Yeah, it's very hard because you see that also even in social circles. It's very easy to cut somebody off if you don't find their story interesting. And you said so before. It's not about asking questions, but it's easy to lead people. So how do you stay that very neutral?
Well,
last one.
It's true. Digitally, it's more difficult to get stories than in working sessions. On the other hand, digital scales a lot.
Yeah.
So when somebody starts to share a story and he writes it, you can look at the length of the narrative and say, somebody spent 600 characters writing a story here. So you can use the length of the narrative as a perfect indicator of what somebody said. Because if somebody takes the effort...
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's a very positive or negative emotions, or people come back multiple times. These are indicators that they really have to share to something.
Yeah, that there's something really the matter.
Yeah, and of course, we always have the story behind the data point. So when you read the story, you are immediately recognize as a human, this is a real story.
Yeah.
This is an important data point.
Fantastic. Well, I think this is definitely a subject I would love to hear much more about, and I'm sure we will do so. But let me finish with one thing, because I can imagine, because you're very begeisterd by it, and for you it's your daily bread and your daily life. What has this storytelling done to your personal life? I mean, has it made you listen differently, or... A slightly tricky question, but I am keen.
It takes the fun out of birthday parties, because you would go to birthday parties and say, how are you doing? And then you say, that's not a P&I question. I should ask, did something happen recently that you think is important? Or you get almost twisted, say, in your private life by always trying to elicit stories from people.
Yeah. So I'm going to do a P&I with your wife and your son or something like that, or your sisters and brothers.
Well, they're so honed after years that they don't. But it's other people that you can still trick.
You can still trick. And for you, Lex?
It's a difficult question. I think more indirect.
Well, it could be it can also be your private business life. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I think how it has affected me is that I've become much more aware of the power that is in all the different experiences accumulated over centuries, as it were, and that's aggregated in those stories. So more respect for tradition, more accepting that some rules that we have a long history, and there is a good reason for having them. For instance, in the past, I never was prepared to wear a jacket because I didn't see why that was necessary.
Thank you.
And now I cannot do without, even if working in the garden, if I do that, which I don't do that often, I'm wearing a jacket as it were.
Yeah. Okay, good. I think this is probably, we're going to continue this debate after you've logged off, I'm afraid. So, this concludes this program about storytelling. Thank you so much for your contributions and responses, and thank you, of course, to our faculty, Lex Hoogduin, Harold van Garderen. It was a true pleasure to have you here. Note in your agendas, the next live GLOCOMNet panel discussion will take place on March 29 with the very renowned David Burge on trust and blockchain. And we truly hope to see you next time again. Thank you so much.